Okay, it looks like we have about 57 people who have logged on, so let's go ahead and get started. I want to echo what Quade just said. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kimberly Freeman. I'm the Associate Dean and Chief Diversity Officer in USC Dornsife, and along with my colleagues, we have been hosting these conversations on a variety of topics at the intersection of well-being and DEI. So we'd like to welcome you to our final well-being conversation of this semester. And congratulations for making it to the end of the semester. And if we have any graduating seniors on the call, congratulations on your upcoming commencement. We've been exploring many different topics, as I said, at the crossroads of diversity, equity, and inclusion and well-being. And today's conversation will be about Wellbeing 3.0, ensuring psychological safety in turbulent times. I'm sure we're all experiencing a lot of different emotions and really having to grapple with many different issues, both in the classroom and in other spaces that we inhabit on our campus, even though we are operating as a virtual university. And so with that, we want to have a really robust conversation about what it means to provide psychological safety to our faculty, staff, and students. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then I will turn it over to our moderator, Quade. Our first panelist is Jody Armour, who is a professor in the Gould School of Law. He has been a faculty member since 1995 and has expertise in many different areas, but is known widely for studying the intersection of race and legal decision making, as well as torts and tort reform movements. Jody is a superstar faculty on our faculty here at USC, and we're glad that he could join us today. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Briana Hinga. Briana is the Assistant Professor of Clinical Education in USC Rossier. She teaches a lot of different topics and works with multiple disciplines, practices, and theories of knowledge. She is interested in knowing how we can use educational research to expose contradictions between equitable ideals of education systems versus historically developed and lived realities of such systems. That's really important at this time as we move people back from, as I said, a virtual educational setting into the on-ground setting all across the segments, whether it's K-12 or higher education. And then we are really delighted to have a student on this panel, one of our superstar graduate students in Dornsife, Maya Yanez, who is the Yanez, I think, sorry, I mispronounced your last name, Maya, who is a planetary scientist and astrobiologist. That sounds really cool. She's a second-year PhD student in our Earth Sciences department, and she works with one of our divisional deans, Yana Min, as at the USC and Morgan Cable at NASA JPL. So I should read this from her bio too, because this sounds really cool. She looks for aliens by studying weird life on Earth in weird places outside of Earth. She is also a stalwart champion of DEI efforts, and we in our Office of Diversity in Dornsife are just proud to partner with her on many different initiatives on behalf of graduate students in Dornsife. So thank you, Maya, for joining us, and thank you, Briana and Jody. So with that, I'll turn it over to Quade.
Thank you for that, Kimberly. My name is Dr. Quade French. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the Provost Office of Campus Wellbeing and Education, and it's my honor to be here with our panelists today. What we're going to be discussing really is around well-being and academics and the intersection between the two. A person's well-being in the academic space is intimately impacted by the content and topics that are discussed. And regardless of whether there is intent to discuss content as objectively and academically as possible, it still is the case that people are impacted and subjected to the emotions and the psychology that comes along with witnessing, viewing forms of media and the content of the various discussions. So we're curious to hear from our panelists at the start here, what happens at the junction of academic freedom and psychological safety? When you hear those from your experiences, what comes to mind first?
I'll dive in first.
Great.
I'm happy to defer, but yeah, I think about the course I just finished teaching and writing my exam for. Well, the exam is going to be given next week in criminal law. And in criminal law, we have to deal with subjects like rape, like self-defense by people like Bernard Goetz, the celebrated subway vigilante who shot 4 Black youth in the subway in '86 and was fully acquitted while they were trying to run out of the subway in his particular case. And I know that those cases are going to be, in many cases for many students, it's going to feel like fingering a bleeding ulcer. Here we are in class talking about the same kind of facts that went down with George Floyd. And now, not only that, you may have to sit in your exam and grapple with George Floyd facts. All right. Or you may be a rape survivor and have to wrestle with rape facts in a final or on the bar. Right. And so how do I, when I've been sorting this out through the years and through the semester, how do I try to recognize that there are those special realities in the classroom? When if I have 70 students in a classroom and I'm teaching rape, I know there's a good chance that 10 to 20 of the students in that class have suffered rape. And when we're talking about racial profiling, police brutality, I know a good number of my students in the classroom have had experience with that. So again, how do we, navigate that conversation in a way that is going to allow those students to fully benefit from the course material, right? By being engaged with it fully, and yet not, kind of unnecessarily, bringing trauma where it already is. So I'll just start there, and I'll be interested in hearing other folks. This has just been an ongoing, issue for me. I learn every year. I try to learn every year something different and a better way to approach it. I've never felt I've just been satisfied. Oh, that's the way you approach it. I've always felt kind of never quite satisfied. So I'm always interested to hear others.
Thank you for that. Brianna, Maya?
Yeah, so similarly, I think about one of the most recent assignments that I gave to my students, which was a lab about climate change. I'm taking a history of life on Earth in the Earth Sciences department this semester. And so, climate change in a very different context than, Black Lives Matter or George Floyd or police brutality is something that people have a lot of opinions on when there's scientific fact that we have to teach. And the way we kind of do it is, we lead them through the logic of like, this is the science behind this. We're not making this opinion based, like here's the science. And then we throw all of these horrible effects that are already happening and that will destroy communities and that disproportionately affect low income neighborhoods of color because of climate change and the effects that come with it. And the last thing we throw in there is hope. We tell them how we can make different changes and how we hope things will differ or what we can do to maybe mitigate it so it's not, climate change and its effects aren't necessarily racist in that regard. So there are things we can do to try to address that. And so I think, just like Jody was saying or Dr. Armour was saying, it's a really hard thing to grapple. How do you, someone had put in the chat, trauma is always in the room, right? So how do you grapple this? And it's kind of, there never really is, at least in my experience so far, a satisfactory answer. But I think throwing in that hope is really important if you can, if there's a place for it. Give all the negative, but also try to end on that positive of there's something we can do about it, or there's some action you can take.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate both of those responses. When I saw this panel and was invited to come be part of this conversation, I was really grateful because, similar to our other panelists, it's something that I think about so much as I move into the classroom. The way that in the chat, it says trauma is always in the room. And we know that. I think this year we have felt that very explicitly as, in all the past years, it's been in the room too. So I always feel challenged to think about how can we create a container within our classroom space that allows us to acknowledge that trauma and allows us to create something that exists both within and outside current norms, which are so harmful, right? When we talk about psychological safety, I think it's important that we ask whose psychological safety, and at what cost, right? Because sometimes, particularly for white students, we may think of psychological safety as comfort. And that comfort can be a lack of growth or really diving into conversations about racism and inequities. And that might be kind of psychological safety in some ways, and then that doesn't allow for growth that we need that actually impacts the real lives and bodies of BIPOC people and other marginalized people. So I think it's important to distinguish between intellectual discomfort on the one hand and cognitive dissonance, which I think is healthy and important to happen in classrooms, versus emotional discomfort and trauma that we want to make sure we're not perpetuating, or at least figuring out how to grapple with together, and figure out how to build relationships that we can help each other process our grief and trauma within the classroom space as we grapple with these issues like the ones that were mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, all three of you have brought up and I appreciate you sharing your experiences as educators wrestling with these questions. And I really like, Brianna, at the end here, how you've brought up this idea of comfort, right, as psychological safety. And I want to put a pin in for a minute, if we could, what we can do concretely to support students, and as we see in the chat, trauma is always in the room. What actions can we do? That hope is a wish, not an act. So I want to definitely get to that, but there's a piece that I think is critical here at the outset. All three of you have described actively thinking about the impact that your curriculum has on the students. And I don't know if that's a universal experience. And so I'm wondering, at the intersection now of perhaps psychological safety or comfort or discomfort of faculty or instructors, what your perspectives are around responsibility at the faculty level to even be thinking about these things, because that, I think, is a foundation for then the conversation of, so what does that faculty member do then when they get to that point that they believe they have a responsibility here? So how did, it could be anything from how did you get to that point to consciously think about these things, to what do you think some of the barriers are for faculty to engage who may be sitting there thinking, well, I am strictly teaching the canon, this is academic and intellectual, that's my job. So I'm curious your reflections on that as panel.
Now, let me give you one quick example concretely that we're wrestling with right now in the law school setting and in law schools across the nation, and that is the N-word in the classroom. A lot of my colleagues in other law schools around the nation are say, hey, the classroom should be kind of like the real world. You should have to build up a certain clinical toughness. You shouldn't be squeamish or in any way queasy around uncomfortable and even odious words and symbols and all of that. They're in the cases. And so, yes, I should be able, as a white professor, when I'm reading a case from the book, to be able to utter the N-word out loud in class, and students should sit there and take it and not complain, because that's what being a lawyer is, developing that kind of mental toughness, and we don't want, it's not a place for, they say things like, not a place for thumb sucking, in our classrooms, right? And so, their idea is not only do they not think about it that much, the student experience, but there's almost a hazing aspect to it that some professors, feel, hey, I went through it, they can go through it, it'll toughen them, it's for their own good, it's kind of, paternalistic, coercive benevolence kind of thing. I don't know what's kind of going on, but a whole lot of stuff mixed in that when I hear them talking about it that way. And to me, when it comes to the N-word, for example, in the classroom, I have a hard time saying to myself, What is the unique benefit that I'm going to get from actually uttering that word out loud as a non-Black person in the classroom? Whatever benefit there is from that, let's say there is some pedagogical benefit. Whatever pedagogical benefit there is from that, let me now weigh it against. Let me think about the psychological trauma it is imposing on students in my classroom, and can I get to the same pedagogical ends by tailoring my presentation in such a way that I don't impose those costs and yet get to the object in my lesson. Yes, I've done it. You know, I wrote a book with the N-word in it. You know, I have a lot of scholarship in it. I tell teachers how to teach my book with the N-word in it, right? They're going to teach it at Northwestern as the sole casebook law school this coming summer. And I've talked to the teacher about it. So yes, you can do it, but you got to want to do it. You got to feel that there's a need to do it and then follow through.
So there's a great deal of just, and again, intentional thought that has to go in. But I really, one piece that really stood out as well is that I think reflects a piece of cultural academia that, you know, many of us experience, is this hazing element, this toughening up, right? As though that's a key piece of your academic development as well in that too.
I kind of wanted to also jump on to like that last portion that you were getting at, Jody, of, you know, there has to be a want. You have to decide that you want to weigh the pros and cons of this action or discussing a particular topic and that it's warranted, right? And, you know, kind of what I'm trying to do in my department is convince people to even consider that, you know, to have that conscious thought. And I think it starts with as simply as, you know, implicit bias training, you know, as like a basic level thing, you know, intro, kind of standard DEI trainings is really what I mean, microaggressions, that kind of, you know, topics, because to be honest, I think the professors that we might be asking to have these conversations, or where the conversations would be most fruitful, aren't the ones that are going to initiate it on their own. And so it's kind of convincing people that this is relevant, that this does have a place on the table. And in sciences, you know, this really comes through with like museum artifacts as like a random, you know, example. These are stolen, like plain and simply. They've been stolen and sold by rich white people for like centuries. And so how do we deal with that now? Like the University of Chicago, or not the University of Chicago, excuse me, the Chicago Field Museum, you know, they have the most complete T-Rex skeleton ever. And they paid millions of dollars for it. They had like McDonald's jump in on that. I think a couple other large companies did as well to help them buy this. And it was taken from stolen land. So it's like, does, you know, who does it really belong to? How do you have these conversations? And to be honest, they have a role in earth sciences, especially in a course like I teach, that's a history of life on earth, a view from the museum, right? Like we're talking about museum artifacts. There's a point to bringing this up. And, you know, the TAs on my teaching team, all of us are like, no, this is really important. We're going to bring it up. This will be a focal point on specific labs. But we have the professor's support in doing that, right? If our professor really didn't think that that was canon or appropriate, then we would also be stunted in that. We wouldn't be able to have that opportunity to have the conversation. So I think it kind of starts with convincing people that the conversation is valid and needs to be had.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Gloria Ladson-Billings has a good piece called "It's Just Good Teaching," as she talks about culturally relevant pedagogy. And it seems like that's what we're talking about here. Like it's just good teaching to actually think about these things and really teach with clear historical understanding, teach about inequities, and teach tools to disrupt them. For me, I think part of why I got to this place, you know, part of the question was, how do we get here, right? As a white woman, I think it might be important to name that a little bit. In my doctoral program, I continually felt confused that we were never really getting to the root issues of inequities in the education system. My program was very white centric. It was a lot of academic writings that we read by white writers that were talking about inequity in the systems. And I just kept wondering, like, you know, from my lived experience, I understand inequity. I never felt that what we were talking about in the class was actually getting to what was actually happening in the classrooms. And it just felt superficial, like it wasn't a good education. So, you know, it led me to really wondering, well, how can we create spaces that actually are meaningful, that actually get to the roots of what's happening and actually create something beyond what currently exists. And I think part of that is just, you know, being a feeling human being who feels suffering and who is in touch with my students, and, you know, who can feel when somebody's in the class really not doing okay, and not just going on business as usual, but taking time to reflect and connect with myself and to the students, and not just let myself sort of be in this fog of, I don't know, going through the motion, business as usual in academia, which to me just feels so empty. And I think these questions are so crucial for us to think about, feel into, and engage with in really messy ways. So it does feel like a responsibility to me.
I appreciate those perspectives. And so as we're talking about the faculty experience here, it seems like that there's a great deal of effort and energy that's required, but there's a belief that these ideas and concepts are important enough that one is willing to tolerate any discomfort that they feel and include these narratives in their work. And I think that that's a really important point, because many faculty that we talk to in our office and in others, it's not that they don't care, but they're uncertain as to how. Right? How to broach these topics that are difficult, or navigate conversations that may be fraught, or talk about difficult concepts or terms like you had mentioned, Jody, as well. And so there's a fear around it. But what I'm hearing also in this is that in some ways, how can you push through that fear knowing that it's still the right thing to do, and where that courage comes from? And for example, Brianna, you were talking about curiosity and really just that internal sense that something was amiss there, that there was half the story you were getting. But that seems like a key piece, at least on the faculty end. And so then with that faculty piece, right, we're talking about the responsibility that sounds like that all of you believe exists for faculty to make these changes. So then what of that, right? What of this idea that teaching is not neutral, that decisions can be made, that faculty can make decisions to shape their curriculum? And one of the things you were getting at least I thought, Brianna, and maybe Maya as well, was the centering of narratives, right? You were describing that in your own education, I think, Brianna, right? So whose narratives are centered, and how that's a choice that can be made as we're thinking about this intersection of academics and psychological safety. So I wonder if you could expand on that a bit.
Yeah, I would love to, because I think that's a foundational part of this conversation, right? If we think that education is this neutral space, we're already in trouble. There are voices that we are using to learn from in our classroom, meaning there's readings that we draw from, and we need to be really clear about who are we centering and whose voices are missing. And then also ask ourselves the questions, who's harmed by that and who benefits from that? So, you know, to be specific, in a research methods class, we critique a paper by Bruce Fuller, who was a professor at Stanford, who did this piece on, it's called Mexican American Toddlers Lag Behind Their White Counterparts. And he uses this Bailey measurement, which is a very white-centric model of development, to say that, oh, look, these white toddlers are at a higher level of language development than Mexican American children. And it's really important for students to have the tools to read that, and to, like, many students and people have very visceral reactions to that. Like, what does this mean? I need tools to actually explain how this is flawed. We know it's flawed. So it's important, I think, to develop curriculums where we learn how to do that critique. And I think what that takes is, so this is a research methods class where they read this paper and critique it, right? But I think what it takes is having a class earlier in the program that talks about the history of colonization, that talks about what it means to know, that talks about how our country has developed certain canons of knowledge, and how that's been really harmful to Black, Indigenous people of color and other marginalized groups. And how we can also work toward more inclusive ways of thinking about what it means to know, what it means to be, and that we need to do that. that needs to happen in a course, like at the beginning of whatever program you're in, because we think about medicine, we think about science, we think about law, that's all super relevant. And then in order to have a conversation in a research methods class, for example, that background knowledge has to be there so that the critique can come and we can think about how to imagine research methods and measures of what it means to know in different ways. And if we don't do that, then we have business as usual, which some people call neutral, and it's harmful because it's centering whiteness.
Yeah, to jump onto that, because you make a wonderful point, Brianna. Like we have to provide these tools. We have to talk about this. We have to introduce the topics correctly. And I think that's, just chiming in of like other actions. I think being upfront about having these conversations and like stating we're going to be talking about, important but potentially traumatic and potentially harmful topics. I think that's a really important first step. But I also wanted to chime in that when we're considering these things, we also need to be student-centric and not consider ourselves for a moment, pushing through that discomfort, pushing through that fear. I do that because I was an underrepresented student. I'm the first generation of my family to go to college, let alone get a PhD. My dad's a Mexican immigrant. So it's like, while I'm white passing, like I'm ethnically Mexican. And so it's, I checked all the boxes. I grew up super poor, like everything that could disadvantage me from going to college, like applied. And so when I was in undergraduate classrooms, I remembered feeling, I was in one particular class, and I was always really upfront about my identities. And so every time we talked about something that was like Latina or Latino basic, my professor called on me to talk. And it's like, I did grow up in those areas. Like I understand why you're asking me, but at the same time, it's like this is supposed to be a conversation, right? So it's like that combination of, I really care about this because I remember feeling uncomfortable. I remember being in those shoes. And so I want to make sure my students don't feel that way. And maybe that is something we just need to reiterate to faculty. I go back to maybe it's just as simple as they don't know, if we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I think it's also, there's a bit of self-responsibility. We need to make it student-centric, which means we as faculty and staff and instructors need to decide that we have to take initiative to be able to have these conversations and decide that our own discomfort needs to be overcome in order to have a better, more comfortable environment for all of our students.
Yeah, I mean, excellent points around the decentering of narratives. But what I was hearing in there as well is, a potential sort of recognition of not knowing amongst faculty, but still, Maya, your belief that there's a responsibility that lies there to not just present these topics and engage in this work, but to create a space of psychological safety by perhaps acknowledging to the class what content is going to be coming up and all that stuff. In Brianna, in your piece that you were talking about, you were mentioning that, yes, it's important for these things to happen in each individual classes, but then I thought I also heard you talk a bit systemically, like it would be great if there were a class at the beginning of the program that students would take that would provide them with knowledge education and a baseline vocabulary and sort of awareness of concepts. And so then that got me thinking much more structurally, right, and systemically as we're doing our work, because a part of this is, what individual faculty can do. And we've talked about confronting discomfort and those sorts of things. But what about structurally may exist currently as a barrier to faculty being able to do this and move into these types of conversations and spaces?
I just really love the point about there being some early class that gives us the basic building blocks so that we can have these discussions later down the road in the rest of the curriculum. We used to have something like that over at the law school. It was called a law, language, and ethics course. Required, first semester, 3 units, not going to be on the bar. Nope, not going to be on the bar. Is this going to be on the bar? No, it's not going to be on the bar. But it defined the spirit of the school. It said, we are an interdisciplinary school. You have to understand language as well as morality to understand law. You have to understand the interrelationship. We're going to pitch it at that level coming through the door. And then you're going to use those tools for the next 2.5 years to apply it to all your courses, those basic building blocks. Now, we've decided this year for the first time to have a required race and law course that everyone has to take before they get out of Gould now, right? Okay, so we're almost there. Now we got it required in the 3 years. If we can now just make it required first year, make it required first year, first semester, then we're treating it just like the law, language, and ethics course and saying it's providing basic building blocks that we can utilize throughout the rest of the education. I'm hoping we can get there.
Yeah, that sounds like a great example of this structural change that could happen. Is there pushback, I wonder? I mean, is there pushback against including this at a structural level in the curriculum coming in the first year as a prospect? And what are your, to the entire panel, what are your thoughts around how, as a community, we can sort of overcome some of those barriers that we might be up against?
I want to hear what the other two have to say. Yes, I'll just say real quickly, yes, lots of pushback, and then we can get into how to respond to the pushback.
So something that we talked about in the planning meeting for this was that, diversity, equity, and inclusion are now a part of our USC values, right? And so is accountability. And so it comes down to me of, we can't have these conversations and we can't be providing the best education we can if we aren't upholding our own values. And I think that means that including DEI as a part of every class, whether that's a science class or a law class or an education class, is imperative. It's a part of our society. And so I absolutely agree that, a race and law class definitely sounds like something I would love to see required in a first semester, first year law school. Not that I know much about law. But I'm definitely with you. I would expect pushback from that. On kind of the counter side of that, you need the faculty to teach those types of classes. I would say that there's quite a few science majors or science faculty that aren't prepared to have those conversations. And so I think it kind of goes back to requiring training. And I think, mandatory training is always hard to enforce, but it has to be more than, some videos and a question that's required. It has to be a conversation, because I think so much of this has to be unlearned in order to have a good conversation about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And in the School of Education, I think something that I've noticed is that the pushback is not usually pushback against the idea of the class. It's like, oh yeah, we want that, we need that, we are an equity-centered school. But the pushback is, it's really hard. It takes a lot of time to change the curriculum. It changes the whole sequence of the curriculum, and it's more time and effort and energy than we have, because we need to do things as efficiently and as quickly as possible. So I think ways to kind of strategize around that are just having real conversations with people who you can say, I know you care about this, and how can we kind of pause and take the time to do the transformation that we need to do, instead of just reshuffling the deck again and again and keeping it the same. Mm-hmm. We also had a student committee that was actually coming to our governance meetings in one of our programs, and the student committee was elected to address anti-Blackness and issues of inequity in our school. And this is the time where committees like that are able to be formed, because of the amazing work of the Movement for Black Lives and the spotlight that we have on racial equity right now and the racial reckoning that we're in. I think this is the time to really push on these things. Because people are listening, and if we don't do it, and especially when students are at the table and they're like, well, we're ready to go to Instagram or wherever else and explain that you're not doing this, I think it really adds pressure to make these changes. And I think that's been incredibly helpful. Yeah, so that's what I'll say about the strategizing around it.
Yeah, great ideas. And what I'm hearing from all three of you actually is that this is essential. And there was a question in the chat that came up, can you tie this back to well-being? And one of the positions that I'm hearing, correct me if I'm misreading this, is that equity and justice and psychological safety is intimately tied to a person's ability to function well academically in the space. Jody, to your examples that you gave at the outset, that those students who have experienced police brutality, for example, are now sitting there trying to write that paper, contending with their own psychological and emotional experiences, potential trauma from their lived experiences, while still needing to complete an assignment in a given time, that their counterpart sitting right next to them who hasn't experienced that has to produce a paper that's going to get an A, that's going to position them to move on to law school after that, or to the bar after that. And so in this connection, tying this all back to well-being, what I'm hearing from the panel is that these are foundational pieces, that being able to have psychological safety, to have a curriculum that's not centered solely around whiteness, that produces feelings of exclusion in the students, is an essential part of academics and of well-being together in those ways. And that by being able to create structures like a class at the beginning to provide people with the first opportunity to connect with these ideas, perhaps coming at the beginning of their academic training as opposed to the end, could really set them up to be able to have better discussions, a better experience of well-being as a community, as an individual later on.
Yeah, I can just give you a quick example of the connection between racial justice and well-being that, again, is in the law school setting I see all the time. I'm going to stay in my lane and focus on the law school, although a lot of what I have to say, I've heard lots of other students in other schools describe as well. In the law school, though, context, you have a fierce competition, more than in most other graduate schools. There's a fierce competition. Class standing can be all determinative of your future, in so many different ways. And at least people feel that way, even though it isn't as true as people think it is. They still have that strong feeling that it is, and it drives them sometimes, to distraction and worrying about it. And into this pressure cooker, in which everyone's thinking about, are you smart enough to be here? Who's smart enough to be here? Who's not smart enough to be here? Who can outsmart whom, right? In the middle of that, I remember when I was in law school, I'm sitting there hearing that Murray and Herrnstein have launched a best-selling book called The Bell Curve that is telling the world that people like me genetically don't belong in places like higher education or law school. Number one, we're genetically inferior. Then, number two, here, law school, again, specific, Scalia, one of the high priests of the legal profession, just before his death, says that, yeah, I think the mismatch theory is right, and a lot of Black law students shouldn't be at these good law schools, right? So, and that, every law student in the country is hearing that. And we're going into the classroom now, saddled with that kind of stigma and stigmatization and all the rest, and having to now, I'm sitting down and I'm going to hear a professor use the N-word in class, and then I'm going to go to another exam. And this is a true story. Some years ago, just before I came to law school, a professor had a tax exam, and the question in the exam was, discuss the tax implications of Kunta Kinte getting his foot cut off, right? Now, how do you maintain, your level, your kind of dispassionate, analytic, as you're supposed to, skills in that kind of setting when it's also unnecessary? So that is how it really directly connects to well-being, and why it is that there is, why there's so much hypertension in the Black community, why there's so many comorbidities that we heard about, why the brunt, a lot of the Black and brown communities bearing the brunt of COVID disproportionately, all of that. That's the health consequences of being told you don't belong over and over and over, even in higher education, wherever you go. Mm.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, and appreciate this clear connection between the content and well-being, because if we aren't actually including content that is inclusive of diverse perspectives, that is naming the inequities that are rooted in our systems, then we're actually perpetuating trauma that students are experiencing because of the content. So I do think it's important for people to take away from this conversation, the content itself is central to students' well-being. And I think as part of that, in addition to naming inequities and having really truthful curriculum, I think part of what Maya said at the very opening statement is making sure that our curriculum and content includes sharing stories, sharing knowledge, sharing wisdom, sharing resilience and brilliance of BIPOC people, of queer people, of disabled people, and making sure that we're not only teaching about the hopelessness that is our system, we're also teaching about the hope and the ways that people have created lives and created futures that now exist and will continue to exist in the future, so that students have models of what that looks like, past, present, and future. And I think that's really important to well-being in the classroom too, to foster that critical hope, which isn't like Jeff Duncan Andrade talks about critical hope, right? Critical hope is not hokey hope, which is like, it's all good, you know, positive vibes only. It's like, this is a really harmful system that we're in, and we acknowledge that, and we can work together in community with each other to acknowledge that and build toward something else and have critical hope. And we need to help students take away tools from our classes to build hope.
That's an excellent point. So, up till now, we've been talking about, the intersections of the individual faculty member and their students and the individual identities that the students are bringing in. And just to chart our course, it seems that the panel's been talking about a structural element that could be really helpful, right? A university or a school adopting a curriculum that positions classes at the outset of a student's academic career that prepare them give them language for engaging in these critical dialogues, being able to, as one of our colleagues says, disagree better, right, in a civil way around these conversations. But there also requires an individual faculty responsibility to be able to understand their curriculum and understand the difference between the intent that they have in creating it and the impact that the curriculum will actually have on the student. And then in moving a bit further, there's this piece now you're bringing up, Brianna, around critical hope, right? And so how then, aside from the faculty being aware and gaining self-awareness and consciousness and thinking about the curriculum and other things, what does this actually look like in the classroom, right? How can a faculty member help create this sense of psychological safety through their actions, and how can they instill this sense of critical hope, this for all the panelists, as they look to apply some of the ideas that we've been talking about here now?
I'll jump in with like a couple, I guess maybe almost easy tidbits. I don't mean that in like a bad way, but I took a course in undergrad that had a couple-day lecture on the Holocaust. And so preemptive to this course, or like to this part of the semester and in the syllabus, it's forewarned that we're going to be talking about, graphic imagery and this very traumatic experience. And the week, it's like 2 days of the lecture or something like that. And immediately preceding it, the professor always says, this is a portion of the course where I will not tolerate laughter. I will not tolerate you, conversing on the side. Like, this is the time where we must show respect. And so I think part of the way you initiate these conversations is to set the tone, is to set the rules, the expectations, the framework in which you're operating this conversation. And I think especially, it depends on the type of course you're teaching, but if it's really discussion based, I always really support the oops, ouch system, which is basically, if someone says something problematic, this person who may feel, I don't want to just say offended because that's not it, just may have feelings about that, says ouch, and the person without trying to defend themselves or anything says oops and tries to listen and understand why what they said was maybe problematic. And I think introducing this type of system is really a good framework for having those types of discussions, because it highlights, oh, something was problematic, but like, let's address why it was, let's try and fix it, let's try and get everyone on the same playing field again, so that the hurt person isn't just sitting there silently hurt and not able to continue with the conversation, and the person who said something damning is being taught how to better phrase that or how to better move forward in that conversation.
Great points, because there was a question that came up from one of our audience members around, yes, psychological safety with curriculum and content, but addressing and creating that same psychological safety in the classroom setting with challenging conversations. And so, Maya, per your examples, you've said that it's in some ways the faculty's duty to almost not forewarn, but to set the groundwork for what the next part of that conversation is going to look like, to let the students know the type and nature of the content that's going to be coming up. And in some ways set some ground rules and some norms of that space, that this is how we're going to interact with each other. This is how we're going to converse. And I think really importantly, I love that idea that you brought up. This is how we're going to handle conflict together. Another piece.
Yeah, I love those. So I do something similar in particular conversations. Sometimes I do set a container that's very clear, like this is not actually a time to debate, this is a time to process, or whatever I feel like is a helpful ask in that space. And then at the beginning of class, every semester, I'm really intentional to invite students to create some agreements. I'll pose those agreements first. You know, I have a solid list that continues to change as I grow. But I ask students to think about those agreements, you know, some of which are acknowledge both intent and impact of my words, of my actions. And have ways to navigate conflict. You know, you want to have clear agreements around those. I like to use the word agreement because I think co-creating the space is important, as opposed to, you know, saying that they're norms or rules. They're things that we're agreeing to. So you make sure that you take the time to set these agreements. I think it's important that there's not too many. People can kind of remember them and to check back in on them. And they can be really helpful, because then if the climate of the class is not in a place that you think is healthy, you can come back to them, you know, week 5 and say, okay, what should we be doing here to get back to what we agreed to? And I think that's necessary in order to build a consent culture, because again, we know that outside of the classroom, the norms are often very harmful. So within the classroom, how do we intentionally build a space where we can learn together, where we can build relationships that are really about, you know, growing together, trying to create some kind of trust so that we can have these relationships. We have to talk about how to do that. We don't just do that outside of the classroom space. So we need those tools. Maybe a couple other quick tools. I think sometimes making sure students can turn their camera off, you know, particularly if you're talking, I mean, anytime, right? People just might need to take a break. They might get really emotional. And I think not having a hard rule of camera needs to be on allows people to have the space to feel their emotions. Mm-hmm. And, you know, generally wanting a camera on makes sense. I get that. I want that too. But giving people grace for that and kind of just trusting that students can listen to their own needs. I don't like cold calling on students. I think that can be tough for some students, can cause kind of continual anxiety. And then maybe just lastly, as a specific thing, telling my own story, I think is important to part of creating this. Like when I move into the classroom, I'm going to tell my story and why I'm here and who I am. And that is particularly also because I'm a white person in a space of education. But I think that's important to building trust, because if we want our students to be doing that, I think we need to model it too.
Yeah, I give my students the option in my criminal law class, for example, of not attending classes when we're covering certain materials that might be especially difficult for them to sit through a live classroom and discuss, you know, clinically, you know, like rape, you know, like self-defense when we get to that stuff and we're dealing with the Floyd, you know, George Floyd kinds of cases. And what that then means, and the reason I have to do that is because when we get in the classroom, those classrooms are going to have to vet hard all the possible sides and bring up even arguments and points that might seem vile to some of us, might seem highly objectionable. How can you even make a point like that, right? But if you don't get those points out in the classroom and you know those points are being made in the courtroom, then the classroom's not very relevant to the courtroom. You got to bring the courtroom into the classroom, right? So we're going to have those back and forth, but, you know, I give them that option. So they're going to have to listen to the class, you know, but you may not have to sit in the classroom. And then then I say, look, but I still have to have the option of testing on this material. Because if I don't say I'm going to test on it, you're not going to take it as seriously. A lot of students aren't going to take it seriously, which means you're not going to learn something about a critically important area of the law like rape. If you don't understand the basic law of rape and the policies behind it, you know, I worry about you saying you understand criminal law. You know, we have about 850,000 rapes a year. It's one of the biggest crimes out here. You got to understand it. So I got to, encourage you as much as I can to study which means it might wind up on the exam in some form, but there's constantly that kind of accommodation back and forth that you're thinking about. I'm trying to think about anyway. And then finally, going on what Brianna said at the end, you know, I also know that every time I walk in the classroom, that there's an issue of social identity that walks in there with me. When I first started writing my last book, I looked a lot more like Obama than I do now. And, you know, so I didn't get any particular remarks about my appearance because I was writing the book, Missed Trips of Peer Architects. My fro grew out a little over 9 months. I went back and my students said, I overheard them saying, and then students told me they were saying, the other students were saying that it's ironic that Professor Armour teaches criminal law while he looks like a criminal, right? I've had downtown attorneys say that when my hair got, you know, more fro-like, and especially when I had a beard and fro, that my appearance was impertinent and unprofessional in the legal setting, right? So I know that is coming into any classroom discussion that I have. You know, that's part of the discussion. I never have to say it, it just is, you know, just like all of us who are, whatever our social identity is, it's right there in the room with us. We don't leave it, we don't check, we don't, you know, doff it at the classroom door and then don it again on our way out.
Mm-hmm. Such a powerful reflection there, Jody. And here we are talking about identities and the academic space. And I see great parallels between what you just shared and how sort of fellow lawyers and students even will remark on your appearance. And the whole point of this conversation, you know, around the lived experience of students, marginalized students in the academic setting, when their stories or stereotypes of the groups they belong to are showcased in an academic way, and the impact that causes at the individual level of then thinking about, having to process, while in addition sort of paying attention to the task at hand in those academic ways. So with the time that we have left, I really do want to thank our audience for participating, for submitting excellent questions, and to the panelists for things that they've shared, their wonderful perspectives on the issues, and some great ideas as well that we hope you'd be able to take away with you. I'd like to just offer up a sentence or two to our panelists. Any reflections that you hope you would like to leave our audience around this topic of psychological safety, around academics, around critical hope, around strategy, whatever it might be. What is it that you would like to impart?
I would just add that if there's something you feel like can be changed, chances are it can be. Chances are there's some resources to help guide you. What happened, you know, the reason I've been working with like Disha and Dean Freeman has been because when BLM happened, I reached out to diversity at USC and said, what can I be doing? What's available? What can I do in my department? What is the current status of, you know, diversity efforts at USC? And to be honest, grad students in my department have spearheaded most of our DEI efforts of just by going out there and finding resources, looking for models at other universities. So I think if you want to have these types of conversations, there's some amazing people on this call or in the Office of Diversity, or I'm sure the Center for Excellence in Teaching, that can help point you in the right direction and help you figure out how to have those conversations. So I would point out that there's probably some really great resources. Check them out.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I know I have a lot of room to grow in this, and continuing to find resources and just be thought partners with faculty, with friends outside of academia to think about this and really reflect upon my practices has been really crucial for me. And then I think one last comment about structural change that we need. I think transformative justice processes within our schools are so important, because as we have these conversations and harms do occur, we need ways to address them in ways that are equitable, in ways that are healing, in ways that actually shift the structures that allowed the harm to happen in the first place. And so I think learning more about transformative justice and trying to bring those processes into our schools structurally would be really important.
Thank you.
Yeah, you know, Quade, like you said, I've been here since '95. I've been here a while, and there's never been a moment like this that I've seen. You know, the Overton window has shifted dramatically in a jaw-dropping way in merely a 7-8 year period, right? And So yeah, now, you know, is just an opportunity to really do something to move the needle. And you are the folks, these are the folks, we're the folks who can really do that now.
Thank you so much. There was someone very wise who I was in a meeting with the other day, I believe it was Darlene Robles, said, I like to focus on the faces that are here and not the people who I think should be here. And I think that's a really important piece as we're looking for ways to find support for bringing about change and finding agency within ourselves. So thank you all so much. Thanks to our partners, to the audience, to the panel. And I wish you all the best as we close out this semester.